Hey, if you want access to the show notes and the links and the transcripts that are mentioned as part of this podcast, you can head over to Seven, so the word all spelled out, SEVEN health.com/304. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Real Health Radio. I'm your host, Chris Sandel. I'm a nutritionist and a coach and an eating disorder expert, and I help people to fully recover. And so two things I want to mention before we get started with this episode. The first is if you are watching this on video, and I've been mentioning recently that I'm doing these video podcasts now. If you're watching on video, you will notice that the background has changed, or where I'm sitting has changed. You may also notice that it's a little bit echoey in here, which I've only discovered as I hit record. It sounds more echoey than it usually does. But I was in an office next to here, maybe like 10 meters away from here. So when we rented the place that we're currently in, the house didn't have a good setup in terms of where I could have an office. And the people who were renting the house to us had another property next door to it that was like we call it a granny flat over here. I looked up in the States, it's called an in-law suite. I don't know what it's called in other places of the world, but it's like an extra property that has one bedroom. It's got a kitchenette and that kind of thing. And I'd been using that as my office, but it was a really big space for me to be using as an office. And so I was chatting with the people who own the properties, and he is a builder. And they said, okay, we'll build you a different office. So where I am currently sitting used to be where there was a jacuzzi, and there was a roof over the top of the jacuzzi, and we were never going to use that. And so they just took out the jacuzzi, and then they whacked up this office. So it's a lovely new space. It's a better size for what I actually need as an office. And then I don't know what we're going to do with the other place. I think there's different plans that I have, that Ali has, that Ramsey has, in terms of what that space will be turned into. But in the immediate future, my parents arrive on this Thursday. And so they will then be staying there, and they have a nice place where they have their own shower and their own space while staying over here. So that is thing number one. So if you hear it being a little bit echoey, that is the reason. I don't know what I'm going to do. I'll see if I can find something, or maybe it's not really a big deal and it can just stay as it is. So if you're wondering why the background looks a little different, that is why. And yeah, I'll show you. This is my pride and joy, is my color-coded bookshelf, which you can see over here. So I'm constantly getting rid of books because I'm buying so many, and every time we move, I get rid of some. But that's where it's at the moment. So the second thing to mention is I'm currently taking on new clients. If you've been living with an eating disorder for a short time, a long time, I would love to be able to help with this. I know when living with an eating disorder, it can feel like there is no way out of this. This is permanent, and I don't believe that to be true. I totally believe that you can fully recover, and I would love to help you do that. And when I think about what I focus on and the way that I work, and I use a method called the transformational recovery method. This is what I've developed over the 15 years of working with people and figuring out what are the things that truly matter. The three main areas that we're working on is, one, how can you fully recover from a physical standpoint? So doing the physical healing that is needed as part of that. And what's important here is this isn't just the physical part of how to rebuild muscle and bone and organs and that type of thing that is really impacted upon by being in an eating disorder, but it's also how the brain and the mind are impacted as well, because this has an impact on the kinds of thoughts and feelings and perceptions and beliefs and memories and all the things that naturally come to mind. And so being in a depleted state has a really big impact on you and your experience. And so it is looking at how we move you out of that state. The second thing is looking at coping skills and developing resilience, because what typically happens is that an eating disorder becomes someone's only way of coping. And we need to figure out and develop other ways of being able to do that. And there are lots of different ways of being able to do that. So it is then developing that area and really developing resilience in that area. And then the third one is looking at how you can get your life back and bring more things back into your life now, not at some point in the distant future. Because I think there's this misbelief about the fact that I will do all this recovery work and then like a butterfly will come out of the cocoon later on fully done. And that just doesn't work. You need to be bringing things back into your life to really give you a reason to keep recovering and to give you a reason for why I want to recover, because I'm now having these experiences of things that are coming into my life and I want more of these to be occurring. So those are the areas that we focus on as part of recovery. If this is something you want help with, and this is something that you have been, as I said, struggling with either for a short time or a really long time, I work with people who have been struggling with this for multiple decades and help them to reach a place of full recovery. So if that is what you would like, I highly recommend that you send an email to info@7-health.com and just put coaching in the subject line, and I can get all the details over to you. So on with today's show, and on the show, it is a guest interview. And today my guest is Dr. Brad Smith. Brad is board certified in adult psychiatry and has experience treating patients in all levels of care. He is the chief medical officer for Rogers Behavioural Health and was previously the chief medical officer for their eating disorder services. He was named a Distinguished Fellow of the American Psychiatric Association, the AAP, joining an elite group of psychiatrists in earning an accolade given to those who've made a substantial impact in the field. He also serves as a voluntary assistant clinical professor in the Medical College of Wisconsin's Psychiatry and Behavioral Medicine Department, where he teaches residents and fellows. So I became aware of Brad fairly recently. Julie on my team was someone who sent me a couple of podcasts that Brad was on, and I gave them a listen, and I really liked what he had to say. And when I dug into him and what he does, there are a couple of main areas that I was really interested in. And so the first was the co-occurrence of other conditions alongside eating disorders. So things like OCD, anxiety, depression, addiction. And so that is one of the areas that we talk about. The other one is a thing called ERP, so exposure and response prevention. And this is a type of therapy or a type of modality that Brad uses and that Rogers use. And it's something I haven't talked about before on the podcast. And I was really interested in it and really interested in it from a practical standpoint and what it looks like in a session and what the goals with it are. And so that was the other thing that I was really interested in chatting about. So we cover both of those things plus lots more. And I really love this conversation with Brad. I'm often talking to individual practitioners or individual coaches. And so there was something nice and different about the fact that I'm talking to someone who is a member of a team and this real multidisciplinary approach that they're taking. And so it just offers a different perspective than someone who is an individual coach like myself who is working in the outpatient setting. So that was great. This was also the first interview that I'd done where the video is recorded. This is recorded just in Zoom at the moment. I have downloaded some other app for doing this moving forward. And so that will come with some future episodes. But at this stage, it was just what I recorded in Zoom. And so if you want to be watching these instead of just listening, then you can do that on YouTube or on Spotify. So that is it. Let's get on with the show. Here is my conversation with Dr. Brad Smith. Hey, Brad, welcome to Real Health Radio. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks, Chris. I'm very glad to be here.
And so you are the Chief Medical Officer for Rogers Behavioural Health, and I know you have this real background in treating eating disorders at all levels. And so there's a lot that I want to chat with you about today, all connected to eating disorder recovery. And I guess just as a starting place, do you want to give the listeners a bit of background on yourself? So who you are, what you do, what kind of training you've done, and then we can go from there.
Sure. Happy to. I grew up in a small town in Wisconsin and then went on to college and then to medical school at the University of Wisconsin. I finished a psychiatry residency also at the University of Wisconsin, then did a year of subspecialty training in the field of forensic psychiatry at the Medical College of Wisconsin, the state hospital in Wisconsin, doing a lot of evaluations for court cases, like assessing people for competence to stand trial, assessing people for whether they were not guilty by reason of mental disease, and also then was providing treatment for many of these individuals after their court case had been settled. So a lot of broad breadth of psychiatric issues, severe psychiatric issues, also interfacing a lot with community mental health in our local communities when we were trying to help people get back into the community from the state hospital. And then quite a detour at that point. I wanted to start doing something different in my career from the standpoint of my day-to-day work, and started looking around for a place to do more general clinical work, and ended up landing at Rogers to be the doctor for their outpatient program, which was partial hospital and IOP programs in the Madison, Wisconsin area. And part of that program was their eating disorder partial program. And I had been pretty comfortable with working with individuals with eating disorders based upon some training in my medical school time and my residency time. Not a lot of people get training in the medical field on eating disorders, but we happened to have a couple of rotations at the time that I had enjoyed. And so there was a need in their inpatient unit to provide some, what I thought at the time was short-term coverage.
Yeah.
And 13 years later, I'm still doing day-to-day clinical work at Rogers over at their original hospital site, which is in a city named Oconomowoc. It's in the western suburbs of Milwaukee. And then have really just grown up in the Rogers system in terms of my eating disorder practice over the last 13 years. And it's been great. I've enjoyed, all parts of that, whether it's the staff psychiatry role that I originally played, or even all the different administrative roles that I've played as the years have gone on.
Nice. Okay. There is definitely some follow-ups that I want to have.
Sure.
So when you went originally to do psychiatry, was it the passion going to be in forensics? And that was always the career path that you thought about? Or like it was more general than that and that you just found yourself in that place?
It was more general than that. And in fact, first few years of the psychiatry residency, I wasn't sure that's what I wanted to do. I probably had something to do with our residency training at the time was, I think it was good, but just happened to focus a lot on pretty general outpatient practice where the acuity or the severity of issues that we were dealing with in a lot of our day-to-day work wasn't as appealing or as challenging. And then I did a rotation with someone who was doing forensic psychiatry and really just thought this is a whole new playing field. This adds a whole other element of thought to the whole process, whole new intellectual challenge. And so I started to learn more about that career path and went to a couple of national conferences around it, but then decided that I wanted to do the fellowship in it. But no, it wasn't on my radar at all as even a field. I really didn't know much about it. That was before all of the TV shows that, like Criminal Minds or things where people now come up to me a lot when they know that I have done forensics and have all these questions or observations from the shows that they're watching. And none of that was really available when I was in training. It was just, this is a brand new field I really hadn't known about until doing some of that work with the individual who's already doing it.
Yeah. When I read that as part of your profile, I was like, okay, that was instantly where my mind went to, like the crime TV shows.
Right.
And so with then the transition into working with eating disorders, what is it about that population or about that area that really interests you or kind of drew you in?
Well, one of the things that was unexpected around how there could be some connection there was really working with individuals as a psychiatrist who also had a lot of physical health issues or complications. Yeah. And so at the state hospital, we had an internal medicine or primary care department, but it wasn't resourced the way a place like Rogers is. And so the attending psychiatrist ended up picking up a lot of that initial primary care, kind of coverage. And things had to get to a certain level of severity before we were really calling in the internal medicine department. I'd gotten used to taking care of a lot of primary care issues. And it was a little scary because that's not the bulk of my training in residency, but that was a part of my 10 years at the state hospital. So when I started to work at Rogers and working with individuals with eating disorders, that was appealing to still have some aspect of the physical health issues and complications as a part of my role. But it was much easier, in fact, because I have this great primary care team that I work with. And right off the bat, the first few weeks of working on the inpatient unit, I was like, this is ironically easier than what I was doing from the physical health standpoint, that I had all this help, but I had all these great mentors to work with, and that really was kind of the bridge that it was doing more than I think a general psychiatrist might do in an outpatient practice. It was having all these medical issues involved. And then the other piece was just the complexity, that intellectual curiosity around how is it that we start to kind of peel back the onion layers of this complicated situation that people have. And so when I was in forensics, that was a lot of it had to do with these legal situations. And then, oftentimes these really unusual or aggressive or severe behaviors that people were engaging in. It's very complicated, and individuals have complicated histories. Individuals have complicated current lives, and all of these things, working on them as a person, it's very, very interesting. It's very rewarding when people start to do the work or have success as they start to make those steps towards recovery. So a lot of similarities, but in some strange ways that I found the connectedness.
Yeah. And as I'm hearing that, and I sort of reflect on my sort of initial training and thinking about where I wanted to end up and how I've ended up where I am with working with eating disorders, it is that, like, the messiness of it that I find really fascinating, and I enjoy being able to deal with, because there's all of these different components to it. And yeah, that is a lot more interesting than what I originally trained in, which is nutrition and like telling someone how much protein they need or how much vitamin C they need or whatever. Like, there was a lot of dryness to that compared to the work that I now get to do working with eating disorders. And so, yeah, I understand your enjoyment of the complexity side of this.
Yes, it really wasn't expected or intentional to make that leap for those reasons, but people would say, what is the connection and why does this appeal to you? And I also found that working in higher intensity areas for people with eating disorders, like inpatient and residential, a lot of it is around, trying to help people to make these changes, these behavioral changes, before they might actually be fully ready or convinced that that's what they want to do.
Yeah.
But there's maybe a medical acuity or necessity to making those changes. And then even some of the characteristics or unfortunate components of eating disorders, which can involve, the secretiveness or the not being as forthcoming. Some of my colleagues have really struggled with that. And I came from working in settings where being forthcoming with your doctor is not common. In a forensic setting, there's a lot of effort volitionally to try to mislead the doctors at times. And so it's been refreshing with, many individuals with eating disorders, even if they've had to be very secretive about their behaviors or their illness. I recognize, and it's easier because it's not coming from a place of, volitional malintent. It's coming from a characteristic or a component of the disease process and a necessity to kind of keep things under wrap. So it hasn't caused me to, have a lot of personal negative feelings if people haven't been fully forthcoming with me. It helps me to really connect with the parts of them that want to get better, the parts of them that seem like they're ready for making that step, even if it's only, 51% of them that wants to get better. Really enjoy them, trying to work the rest of the way with them to try to get it to a better place.
Yeah. And I wonder, like, how many of the people that you're seeing then in the setting, and maybe it's more the inpatient setting, are there because they're truly choosing to be there versus there because, I don't know, their parents are sending them there or something along those lines? Because it's interesting, like, when I'm hearing you say about people not necessarily being forthcoming, definitely that is occurring on some levels with people I work with, but I actually don't find that it happens very often. And maybe that's because I'm in the setting where people are intentionally reaching out and wanting to work with me, and they will be telling me stuff that they haven't told anyone else. But there's a recognition of, like, there's no point me putting on a charade. There's no point me kind of trying to say something that's not true, because, like, Chris isn't going to be judging me. Chris isn't going to be doing anything apart from, like, tell me what's going on, and then we can figure out what to do with this information. And so from my perspective, I feel that people are pretty forthcoming, but I am also aware that I'm getting people who are selecting to work with me, and it's kind of a different thing to possibly what's going on with some of the people at Rogers.
I would imagine it has a lot to do with the correlation of the severity or intensity of the level of care that someone is in. That certainly when we have people in our less intense levels of care, we're really at that point where everybody's walking together and people are calling it out when their behaviors are slipping or something of that nature. We try to make that very clear when people are coming in or when families are kind of twisting the arm of their loved one to come in, that this is a voluntary program. And in fact, in our state of Wisconsin, involuntary treatment is really hard to actually even, to do. It's a lot of protections in the state for that. It could be someone's family is twisting their arms. It could be that their outpatient providers have said, we don't think we can work with you any longer unless you go do this. So they are coming in voluntarily, they're signing in, but that doesn't always mean that can be a little bit fluid. They might be really convinced when they walk in the door, but then once they start to get acclimated to the unit or the program, it can feel very overwhelming at times. And then, there can be a lot of wavering on how much they want to be there or how much they want to do it at this time. And we really try to work with that. It's been something I really try to help impress upon our teams as well, that even if somebody, comes in, gets overwhelmed, that is still possibly a very, very important piece of that person's recovery. Because if they came in and they kind of sized it up and got it, some awareness of what this might look like, what it might be like to participate, they might have to go home and regroup. But there's a good portion of those individuals who will come back and then complete the process because they just were so overwhelmed with the transition. So yes, they're all different levels of readiness. And I think it's fluid even after somebody has agreed to come in. And, I think we all deal with that ourselves in terms of being, we're not always 100% committed to everything that we do. And this adds many, many other elements to it for an individual making these important decisions.
Yeah, totally. And one of the modalities I use a lot is polyvagal theory. And I think using that way of thinking in terms of describing and understanding the nervous system and the idea like we are always perpetually in a state. And in those different states, we all have different kinds of thoughts and feelings and sensations and perceptions that come to mind. And so, there are points where, recovery feels like the thing that is most important and I really want to do it. And there's all these reasons why. And then 20 minutes can pass or 48 hours can pass and someone feels very differently about it because there's something has occurred that has created this shift in their state, which causes other thoughts and feelings to come to mind. And so one of the things I wanted to go through before we kind of dive into the stuff around eating disorder recovery and some of the things I want to talk to you about was just like more about you and your background, like in terms of like your relationship with food as a kid and growing up. What was your relationship with food like?
Some components in my life that I think give me a lot of, empathy, also help me resonate with the struggles that people have. I did not come from a background where I developed a full-on eating disorder. There was a lot of eating that was, by today's standards, considered not the best practices, and a lot of free reign as a kid in terms of eating patterns. And basically it gotten to a place where at some point in my middle school years, I was, a lot towards the types of things we think of now as causing health problems with whether it's ultra processed foods, a lot of free range on doing desserts. And at some point that was affecting me as an individual in terms of wanted to play sports, wanted to be healthy. And I had the good fortune of meeting with a doctor in our local community who I think was ahead of his time from the standpoint of how health and nutrition works together, and also, set a path that was towards health and not towards anything that was probably more popular in the day with the diet culture. But started teaching me about, trying to make small changes in how I would eat so that it would be a lifelong process of doing better with what was happening with my health, trying to move away from, like I said, ultra processed foods and more, why don't we, have things more from sources we know where they're from, trying to move away from as many desserts as I wanted to. Let's try to eat more balanced and look at kind of the macronutrients of things, but not to do it in a ultra precise way, but just try to get a more balanced approach. The very things I see being taught all the time now in terms of proper balance of macronutrients and a proper physical activity, but that really shaped my experience moving forward. And I was able to get to a better place in terms of how I would eat as part of a balanced meal plan, helped steer me in a way that I wish that, frankly, more people would have the good fortune of that experience, where it wasn't inundated with diet culture type material or recommendations. It really was about setting up a plan where your life has some physical activity, has the ability to have, good food, have rich foods when you want, but also trying to find some balance in the macronutrients and how you eat moving forward. So it really helped me. It helped shape, my interest in health. It helped shape my interest in medicine. And then I think that has helped me to have this experience where, when working with individuals who have ended up in a very bad place with their relationship with food and developing eating disorders, it's allowed me to have much more resonance with the struggles, much more resonance with how somebody can chart a path that doesn't have to go down a path of an eating disorder if they can get some good information, some good encouragement and support early on in their life.
Nice. The thing that I hear with your story is often how so many people end up in an eating disorder. Like, it's amazing how many people start out with these good intentions where, you know what, I've been getting a lot more bloating or digestive issues. Let me see what I can change to help with that. Or,
Right.
yeah, I'm finding I'm just a lot more tired, and let me see what I can do with this. And so going down the road where it feels like this is one is going to be supporting myself in a really good thing. And two, this feels somewhat innocuous. Like, I'm not doing anything dangerous here. I'm not doing anything extreme. And then it kind of fast forward 2, 3, 4, 5 years later, and they're in a completely different place and not a very good place. And so it's lovely to hear that you had this experience where you were able to recognize that there are things that you were doing that weren't leaving you feeling the way that you would like to be feeling, and you were able to change that and do that in a way that is sustainable, that was enjoyable, that actually is something that you've been able to continue doing for the rest of your life, as opposed to it being this very black and white, or this very all or nothing, or this very extreme way of making changes.
Right. I think that's what's really helped in terms of seeing the slippery slope that you described, that is such a common story that you just described, of someone having the best intentions, starting to make some changes, getting some information that maybe isn't the best, and then kind of going too far. And the next thing you know, it's got control of a person's life. The other piece that probably helped me around that time or helped the way that our family ate, was that my mom ended up getting type 2 diabetes diagnosed around just after I started to want to make these changes. And that changed her way of eating in our household. And family history, my genes were a lot of people with type 2 diabetes, a lot of people with cardiovascular problems. And, so I wanted to do whatever I could to put me in the best position possible for, that sort of genetic profile as well. It's been amazing to me how far ahead of the game that I think the doctor that I happened to see at the time was. At the time, it was not kind of well accepted or well known. It was just the very things we hear now is kind of part of like what we might think of as good advice from a nutritional standpoint, good advice from a physical health standpoint, wasn't really the main focus of physical health clinicians or even the field of dietetics at the time. So I realized most days how very lucky I was that was the person that I saw at the time.
Yeah. And I also want to just mention, because I know how these conversations can sometimes be heard by someone who is living with an eating disorder or in recovery, of like, oh, I now need to be on the lookout for diabetes, or I now need to be doing things to worry about my cardiovascular health. And so I want to kind of just remind everyone, like, the context matters. And there are things that Brad was doing that were applicable and helpful for him, given the state that he was in, versus the state that you may be in. And these things are largely irrelevant, because the most important thing for you is not having an eating disorder versus what may be more important for Brad. And so I'm very aware of how these kind of conversations can be misconstrued, and the eating disorder can kind of jump on them and turn them into something that they're really not.
Right. Yeah, appreciate
Yeah.
that qualifier there. Yep.
Yeah. And so one of the things I heard you talking about on a previous podcast that I really want to just highlight, and you did a really good job talking about this, is just the seriousness of eating disorders. And I think that probably most people can understand the seriousness, but often when you're in the midst of it, it can be sort of hard to grasp this. And I don't think that fear is typically a very good motivator for people. It doesn't have a very good, long-lasting impact. It momentarily may do something, but in the long run, not much. But yeah, I think just starting out, just the seriousness of eating disorders from your perspective, what would you say on that topic?
Well, if they're extremely serious, and I agree with everything you just said, Chris, that, fear is not a great long-term motivator, but it can help to set the stage for the importance of something. One of my first years at Rogers and doing eating disorder work, I had been asked to, appear for, I think it was the Eating Disorder Awareness Week, and appear on a local TV spot, just a short segment. And I really came in with the idea of impressing upon the audience, and anyone listening, to try to seek help if they, were feeling any sort of need, if they were feeling any sort of resonance with what was being discussed as part of the eating disorder awareness. And typically a very positive person, I try to look for, the hope and the recovery for individuals. And it must have come across as being, overly optimistic, but it landed pretty poorly on the parent of a adult individual, their child who had not made it with their eating disorder. They had died because of their eating disorder. And so I heard from that parent, connected with me later, indicating she really wanted to impress upon me that it's great to have this positivity around hope and recovery, but that as a professional in the field, that, kind of called me out that I didn't cover the seriousness of it. And that really helped to make me very aware that as positive as I try to be as a clinician, as positive as I try to be as a person, and am looking for those ways to help people connect with their hope for recovery, that I have to balance that with the seriousness of these illnesses. So that has really stuck with me, and I try to include that in any sort of more publicly viewed type interview or statements that I make about eating disorders. So, that's the somber part of what we all talk about, what we all deal with. And of course, that raises all of the reasons why we have to continue to work for more awareness and more ways of making sure people have access to care.
Yeah, I think fairly similar to you. I'm someone who is very much full of hope, and I believe that everyone can make a full recovery, and will always kind of tout that message. And also that there is seriousness to this. I put out an episode last year about the fact that I'd found out a client who I'd been working with prior had passed away. Right. And so, yeah, I definitely agree with you that we need to find this balance between, giving huge amounts of hope and then also not making light of just how serious these things are.
The eating disorder is not balanced, and how it will continue to just, pound that message that everything is fine.
Yeah.
This isn't a big deal. That blood in your vomit isn't a big deal. That losing your teeth isn't a big deal. You can keep doing this. I mean, those are the messages that are going to keep coming. So I try to know that I need to keep providing the information about, well, here are the facts around it. Like, when these things are happening, here's what's probably happening in your body. Here's what's probably going to happen next. Trying very hard not to make it just a fear-based, but to make sure it's a very informed decision that someone is making then of whether they want to choose recovery or whether they want to continue those behaviors, and recognizing that there's a choice there, but it's not like it's all choice. There's a very strong illness that's pushing somebody down the path of trying to cover up the seriousness of the likely consequences of the eating disorder.
Yeah, definitely. And just kind of piggybacking on what you said there, in terms of the symptoms, for so many people, it can feel like this riddle of like, I just don't understand why this is all occurring. And it's actually pretty straightforward of like, your body's just not getting the amount of energy and the amount of nutrients that it needs. And that has an impact on every system, every organ in the body. And so, there are all these different things that are occurring, and they make sense through the lens of when your body doesn't get what it needs, it has to turn things off. It needs to turn things down. And the symptoms are the sort of end result of that.
Right. Eating disorders are similar to many other illnesses or conditions where people sometimes can channel those close calls into some form of really good motivation for the recovery.
Yeah.
We don't wish that on anyone, but we also don't want to cover it up when it's happening. So at least my style is to try to be, very informative for people about if we're seeing something, subtle going on in their labs. And it's okay, well, maybe it's still not a big deal, but these are the early signs that things are going wrong at this part of your body. Or if we're seeing something on their EKG that is not something that's going to mean that maybe a cardiologist may not want them to do any sort of intervention right now, otherwise healthy, we don't see those things on their EKG. So it's about trying to be a good healthcare advisor as well, because not all the specialists, as great as they are and as knowledgeable as they are in their field, kind of circling back to what I said later, there's not a lot of training for medical professionals in eating disorder work. So they may not be seeing it through that lens, and they may be, in some cases, overzealous in terms of what they might advise for an intervention. In some cases, not as worried as they might need to be because they're not factoring in, or maybe they're not aware of what's going on with the eating disorder for that individual.
Yeah. There's a lot of diet culture that then makes its way into doctors. And so the amount of times that I've had clients who are really struggling, where they've had bone density scans that are showing that they've got sort of osteopenia, where they're not getting their period, where there's like all of these things that are going on for this individual. And yet they're being told like, oh, it's great, you should really keep up the level of exercise that you're doing. It's clearly helping. Or you should definitely, I wish I could eat as healthy as you. And just kind of really reinforcing so many of these behaviors. And rather than seeing them as like, this is a real big problem and it's creating a lot of the things that we're seeing, there's a lot of more like, oh, head scratching of like, oh, I don't understand why you're not getting your period, or why you've got osteopenia at age 30. Like, it just doesn't make sense.
Right. We talked earlier about not wanting to use fear as a motivating factor, or the main motivating factor for people. But I think those are the types of messages that help, medical providers who may not have had a lot of eating disorder training, is really just continuing the message about the severity, the mortality, the morbidity. That usually makes other doctors take notice. Even people that are really, I think, sensitive and want to be aware of what's going on in individuals with eating disorders, there, again, just as a lack of formal training for most people who go through different residency programs, or whether that's primary care or subspecialty programs, a lot of training for medical professionals, the way that I hope it will be in the future.
Yeah, we are on the same page with that. And I think it's for how common eating disorders are, and especially we then branch it out and look at more disordered eating that might not get an official diagnosis, but is still creating a lot of problem in people's lives. It's a huge percentage of the population, and outstrips a lot of the other things that we are very concerned about, and gets a huge amount of attention and huge amounts of trainings within doctors' training. And so, I do hope that in the not too distant future that we are seeing that there is this really big shift of recognizing how common this is, because I do think it's getting missed.
I think there's a corollary, with general mental health issues as well. And we see pretty good traction happening there in primary care offices, pediatricians, internal medicine, family practice offices, where there is much more awareness about general mental health issues. There's more effort, there are more system-based work happening to try to integrate the care for general mental health issues. And so if the eating disorder field can continue to kind of take the cue of what's happening there and try to infiltrate the same way, there are a number of factors, I'm sure, that lead to that. Part of it is general mental health or psychiatry, psychology, trying to move into those sort of settings and try to change the narrative of how much time you're spending on mental health issues. The screening tools that have been implemented, a lot of that, though, was probably felt by the primary care clinicians as, something that they started to pull for or ask for, because by default they were asked to be helping people with their mental health issues. But the general lack of psychiatry providers in, at least in the United States, has meant that a lot of the prescribing for general mental health, medications has been from the primary care office. So the primary care clinicians are starting to pull for more training, more information. So you're seeing that in their residency programs and medical schools. And there's every reason to hope that our eating disorder field can do some of the same things and get more infiltrated into those same training centers.
Yeah, well, I have everything crossed that's what starts to occur. And so I'd love to chat about some of the overlap between eating disorders and other conditions. And there's a few that I want to go through. And I think these are probably stuff that's treated as well at Rogers, or we can remove the word probably from that sentence. I know that it is treated at Rogers. And so the first one would be OCD. And so OCD and eating disorders. And so I'm going to just start in a very general way, tell me about the overlap between these two.
Yes. There are a number of ways that we have seen over the many years that individuals have been doing eating disorder work, that the overlap here. And part of it can be simply a recognition that a lot of eating disorder symptoms and behaviors can have a lot of overlap with anxiety-based fears, anxiety-based symptoms. So it's not too much of a stretch to think of eating disorders as having a large component of anxiety as a part of it. And they're often, we see a lot of obsessive compulsive qualities in the symptoms and behaviors of individuals with eating disorders. There are a lot of obsessive compulsive qualities of the symptoms and behaviors. And so there's always been this understanding there's a lot of overlap there, or obsessive compulsive qualities. The co-occurrence rates are much higher than the general population. So I think they're in around the 20% range, which is probably an underestimate of people who might have diagnosable OCD. Of course, I see a skewed version because Rogers is so well known for OCD and severe anxiety disorders that a large portion of the individuals that come to Rogers, among all the different places they could get treatment for eating disorders, many of them have severe OCD and anxiety. There's a percentage of people that have that overlap where both disorders, conditions can be separately diagnosed. We have the overlap where there are a lot of obsessive compulsive qualities to somebody's eating disorder. And then there's also some understanding that in many people, the OCD and anxiety may predate the eating disorder. And so you have this underpinning of OCD related features going on in their eating disorder development and in how it manifests or comes out from a behavioral standpoint. So it's very fascinating, partly because OCD and anxiety is one of the more interesting disorders from the standpoint of having a pretty clear path of how it gets better. And while there are many, many different ways of addressing OCD and severe anxiety, I think there's pretty good consensus that exposure-based principles, exposure-based CBT is the exposure with response prevention is at least the foundation of what is likely to work or what we think is the best way to work with individuals with OCD and anxiety. So the more that we see those obsessive compulsive qualities, or especially if somebody has a fully diagnosable OCD condition in addition to their eating disorder, then we start to think those sort of treatment techniques are probably going to play a larger role or help their success compared to maybe other forms of psychotherapy or other medical interventions that we might think about.
Yeah, there's a lot that I want to say connected to this, but I guess to start with, what's the diagnostic criteria for someone to have OCD? Do you know that off the top of your head?
I don't know that I can quote the DSM for,
but
DSM
the generally,
it's obsessive thoughts, intrusive obsessive thoughts, or fears around things that classically are considered to be not part of the person's values or wishes. They see these things as foreign. These obsessions, these thoughts, these fears are perceived as foreign. They're not part of who that person is or what they want to be thinking about at the time. And then the compulsions are the acts or behaviors that someone is doing to try to neutralize or reduce those obsessive thoughts or fears. And it's really, then it becomes more about the severity, the functional impact of those two features, and trying to assess if there's full criteria being met based on primarily those two domains.
Yeah. And the reason I asked that was like, I'd heard you talk about the criteria before on a podcast. And when I listened to it, I was like, I don't know anyone that I've worked with an eating disorder who doesn't also fall into that criteria. And so
Sure.
When you said, I think you said earlier, like, oh, it's like a 20% overlap. From my perspective, I think I struggle to think of someone who OCD wasn't part of their eating disorder. Like it just,
Right.
It feels like the two things go hand in hand because there are all these compulsive and intrusive thoughts. There are all these behaviors that someone is doing in an attempt to alleviate those symptoms and sensations and feelings, etc. So it feels like OCD is pretty much baked into an eating disorder. And I'm kind of wondering, from your perspective, can you see that it could be, you could have one but not the other? Like, could you see that you could have an eating disorder without OCD?
I think so, but and I was trying to not oversell it, Chris, but you've done a good job of selling it. Because a lot of the reasons why we had adopted the exposure-based principles as a main part of our treatment of eating disorder symptoms, behaviors, is because of that strong overlap that you just described. Like, when you describe intrusive, think about the intrusive thoughts of body image, thoughts that feel like they're foreign or somebody's placing it there, the fears, and then fears of taking on weight or taking in calories in some circumstances where people feel like, get to a point where they feel like even if they haven't eaten the food, if they're just close to the food, that somehow they're going to gain weight. And these thoughts that are not based in logic, that become intrusive or repetitive, but it probably isn't going to show up on the most well accepted OCD measurement tool, the Yale-Brown Obsessive Compulsive Scale. The Y box is what's used to really try to more quantitatively see if somebody's getting to a level of severity to diagnose OCD. But those sort of repetitive thoughts about body image, those sort of repetitive thoughts about maybe that food is going to lead to me gaining weight even though I haven't consumed it, probably not going to show up on the Y box. So that's what we're both saying, that there's a strong overlap of the core symptoms and beliefs that seem to occur, especially as the eating disorder gets more severe, really feel like OCD and severe anxiety at the core of it. Can they exist separately? I'm sure that they can, and I think that they do. Big overlap that happens. So that's again why we had adopted the exposure-based principles. The ERP is one of the main treatment philosophies for even the eating disorder symptoms and behaviors. Even if somebody doesn't have a separate diagnosis of OCD and anxiety because of all the things you mentioned, that these OCD-like features as it relates to the eating disorder symptoms have been so pervasive. And I share with people, if they come in and they have tried other treatment approaches before, say, I don't know if I have the evidence or the literature to say that this approach is better than other approaches. We don't have that sort of way to say that, but it is probably going to be different than what you've done before. If we're adopting a high focus on exposure-based principles, it's going to feel different than other approaches you've done. And so if you've tried, 4 or 5 approaches that feel very similar, at the very least, this is something different. And there's still going to be a lot of core principles that will be the same around what's happening with nutrition, what's happening with work on mood, and et cetera. But when it comes to those exposure-based principles and the work you do there, it will feel very different than other forms of therapy.
Yeah, I very much adopt the idea that eating disorders are anxiety disorders, and very much see them through that lens. And so, what I'm working on always is around exposure. Because I think that is the way that someone overcomes the eating disorder. That's the way that someone does the nutritional rehabilitation that they need to do. That's the way that someone learns the coping skills that they'll use well after the eating disorder is gone, to be able to have uncomfortable thoughts or feelings show up and be able to to create room for those things, or to be able to allow them to be there and not be hooked by those thoughts. And so, yeah, from my perspective, like, this isn't just a great way of helping someone recover from eating disorder. It's like, this is then like the training ground for helping someone to truly have more resilience, to be able to deal with the challenges of being a human being, and all the stuff that life will inevitably throw at one another.
Mm-hmm. I agree. That's what really had hooked me on it, as well as been the resilience component of it. I was doing some, fair amount of reading and even talking with people about resilience factors. And then as a system, we started to look at bringing in this exposure-based approach, which, as you indicated, it very much felt like this is a lot of what different disciplines are doing already, but we may not be tracking it. We may not be kind of putting it on paper to help make sense of it the way that you do when you start adopting exposure-based CBT. But once you start doing that and can speak the same language as a team, I totally agree. It was something I was seeing happening already, especially I think our dietitians were already doing a lot of that work in terms of what are the safe foods, what are the fear foods, and how do we get there, but maybe not tracking it quite as closely as they do with this full immersion of the exposure-based ideas.
Yeah. And so I definitely want to get into the exposure piece. I guess the one extra, or there's two extra co-occurring conditions I'd like to ask about. So we've talked about OCD, we've talked about anxiety, and kind of putting them pretty much in the same sort of category. And I want to just add something that I've definitely talked about, and I've heard you talk about on podcasts as well, is that for most people, this predates the eating disorder. Like, the person
Right.
who typically ends up with an eating disorder, or for many people who end up with an eating disorder, their baseline anxiety was higher than the population average. And that when they got the eating disorder, after the honeymoon period of the anxiety feeling like it's coming down from doing these behaviors, the anxiety was very high. And then once you get over the eating disorder, you're going to have higher anxiety than the average person. Like, I think there's this misunderstanding sometimes of like, I'll do recovery and then all the anxiety will go away. And it's like, no, it won't. If this was there before, it's going to be there afterwards. And what you will learn is ways of being able to cope with that, ways of being able to tolerate that, ways of being able to deal with that in a constructive way, as opposed to the eating disorder. So I just wanted to add that. Do you want to add anything extra?
Yeah, I think it's the very reason why those studies are important, because it's not just about academic hair splitting on which came first. It's about how do we help somebody so that they really get to a better functional place, that they really can live their true lives. And I think that in some circles of our field, whether intended or not, there came this thought that seems to be fairly pervasive, that when the eating disorder is all better, all these things will go away, because maybe these other things felt a lot worse, or they were more prominent when the eating disorder was bad. And and even as we try to understand the biology or the physiology around what's happening when people are malnourished, we like to hope and think that, well, now that they're in a better nutritional state, the neurotransmitters will be in a better balance, and they have the protein stores to make new neurotransmitters. So, a lot of these things should get better. And some of them do. But if you already started off with a, diagnosable anxiety disorder before the eating disorder, then it's not going to get back to maybe where you're going to function the best or do the best. And so that's where I think it became more clear as time goes on, that trying to work on all the things that are adding to the person's troubles functioning, that the eating disorder might be the one that's taking the top priority, because there's so many nutritional and medical acute issues and psychiatrically acute issues that can happen when the eating disorder is severe. But if we end up, siloing the treatment, saying we're just going to work on the eating disorder right now, we'll tackle the anxiety or the OCD later, most people's experience is similar to mine, where those other things tend to just kind of get worse when one gets better. So if we're not comprehensively trying to help somebody in a holistic manner and help them as a person tackle all the things that they're dealing with, as hard as that sounds, that seems to be a better key for success than trying to siloing each separate part of their mental health issues or challenges.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you on that. And I think, like, for me, the Minnesota Salvation Experiment was like a really good thing that's been this real cornerstone of so much of our understanding around eating disorders and malnutrition and all these things that happen. And I think some of that kind of as part of that experiment, you saw the men really kind of have all of these mental health challenges because of that. So they had higher anxiety, they had higher hypochondria, they had higher depression, they had all these things occur, and then as they got better, they disappeared. And so I was like, oh, okay, this is just what happens as part of recovery. But
right.
The thing is that with those men, we don't know what happened prior to the eating disorder. And actually, what we do know about those men prior to the eating disorder is that they were in good, robust health where they weren't having these conditions going on. And the reality is, for many people with an eating disorder, yeah, their anxiety didn't start when the eating disorder started, or their OCD didn't start when the eating disorder started. It started well before that. And I think that's an important thing to remember.
Right.
Yeah. The next occurring condition I want to talk about is depression. And do you think about depression in the same way as anxiety, and it's the same way as OCD, and it's an exposure-based thing, or depression when it's co-occurring with an eating disorder, and it needs to be thought about differently?
I think it needs to be thought of differently, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the whole treatment approach changes categorically, meaning like we might still use exposure-based principles for eating disorder symptoms and behaviors, but what we're doing with a lot of the rest of the time with an individual, instead of being just more exposure-based principles for their OCD or anxiety, might be then we're doing more other types of CBT, behavioral activation, more CBT, DBT skills, things that will help with the depression and the mood regulation, especially like in those individual times with folks. So there's a change in how the psychotherapy is being delivered based on those co-occurring issues. It's very individualistic. Somebody may have their depression might be at a state where, just from a state of melancholy or a state of not being able to do much or feeling overwhelmed with much of any activity, we may be doing a lot more on distress tolerance and behavioral activation to try to get the depression to a better place to really handle the exposure-based work. We of course try to prioritize nutrition, as there's the adequate nutrition and the trajectory forward for nutritional stability is paramount. So if we're going to be asking somebody to tap into all their reserves in terms of their willingness to kind of tackle something, we're going to be asking them to do that around their nutrition as kind of the main foundation, and then maybe work on some of their other anxiety or OCD related symptoms at a little later time, and focus a lot more on their depression in the moment. Depression has always been easier for me to get a better sense of whether somebody had it before the eating disorder got bad. As you said, anxiety disorders are a little bit, or they can fly under the radar a little bit for people, or not as easily for others to have diagnosed or said, this is a problem where, you should get help for it. But we might learn in retrospect, if we really ask closer histories, that people were having panic attacks pretty regularly, or they were having severe social anxiety regularly, but they may not have ever sought treatment for it. Whereas our folks who have depression co-occurring with their eating disorder, it's, for whatever reason, seems to declare itself more readily, before or after the eating disorder has started. So I'm not as surprised about that when we discover, we usually have better awareness of that than the anxiety disorders. We have to do a little bit more digging, maybe with the family, or maybe go back with the individual and find out more of their history.
Yeah. And the other thing that comes to mind connected to that, and this is something I've seen a lot more of and doing a lot more sort of reading and researching on, is just the co-occurrence of neurodivergence and eating disorders, whether that's ADHD or autism spectrum disorders, and just how common these two things are with eating disorders. And one of the things that is very common with that is the masking that occurs. And so, yeah, for a lot of people, they've been masking this for so long that often they are not even recognizing that this thing has been going on. And so that can be another reason why the anxiety cannot be so obvious, or it can look like something different to what it is prior to the eating disorder.
Right. And I think the continued expansion of understanding of different types of eating disorders has allowed us to start seeing more of that co-occurrence, and even how something might have been explained by somebody's other issues. So if you take autism spectrum disorder, there may be some particular forms of ARFID that have flew under the radar because we didn't necessarily have a diagnosis of ARFID, 30 years ago. So the better awareness, the better description of these disorders, and better understanding of them has helped us start to parse some of this out. And I think also then as treatment providers, as treatment centers, there has to be continued pivoting and flexibility and trying to tailor the treatment to help individuals that might not have been in our treatment centers in the past because these things were not diagnosed as an eating disorder before. The same kind of technique of how do you deliver eating disorder treatment can't be just based on what works for anorexia and what works for bulimia. With the expansion of different diagnoses, different illnesses, then the people coming to us for treatment need different things than they might have 20 or 30 years ago.
Yeah. And even within anorexia or bulimia, or if someone is on the autism spectrum, right, what they need in their recovery can look different. And I think often what was then chalked up to, well, that's just the eating disorder, no, that's not. That's actually a really legitimate request that I have because this thing is much more overwhelming because of my neurodivergence, or actually because I have demand avoidance as part of my autism. Mm-hmm. We need to tailor the way that I'm being spoken to, or we're setting goals, or whatever it may be. And so, yeah, this complexity of really understanding the person in front of you and being able to collaborate on, like, hey, we both have this common goal. We really want to get to a place of full recovery. You want this, I want this. How do we make this happen? And so, yeah, from my perspective, I'm always wanting to do it in that collaborative way. And like, I can be blunt, or I can like tell someone when I'm like, I'm not sure that's the greatest idea, or I think that's actually more the eating disorder being in the driving seat. But also, like, autonomy and respect for someone is hugely important as part of the recovery process.
Yes. Practitioner standpoint, whether you're a therapist or a dietitian or psychiatrist, psychologist, I mean, that's where I think a lot of the art comes into it.
Yep.
That we continue to try to evolve evidence-based tools and techniques, but there's not always a ready-made evidence-based technique for the person in front of you. And you might be piecing together a few different things, but it's mostly about, as a clinician, trying to find the connection with that individual and what's going to work for them, and how that your interaction might be better or worse based on how you make changes. It's not that we can't, as clinicians, be the exact same person or the exact same delivery with each different person in front of us, that it takes the awareness of the different evidence-based tools and how they might apply and which ones might be best. All of us are often faced with situations where, somebody may have a nuance, or may have some characteristic, or may have something that they bring to the table that's going to make it important for us to do something more individualized with how they approach those evidence-based techniques.
Yeah, like it definitely is a relationship. And just like as you're talking about that, just kind of going through different clients I work with, and there's times where I use a lot more humor with one person. There's times where I am a little more direct with one person, or like there's times where I'm using a lot more metaphors or analogies with someone else. It's just because from having these conversations, you've started to figure out where things land and what things tend to work better. And so, yeah, I definitely think this is an art form as much as anything else.
Mm-hmm.
The final co-occurring condition is substance use disorders. And so for me, this isn't something that comes up very much. I don't know why. Maybe I haven't talked about it enough or written about it enough. But is this something that common that you're seeing at Rogers? And how does that impact on the treatment?
Yes, it's common in terms of going back to the different levels of care, different intensities of care, like inpatient or residential. We're likely to see circumstances where things have gotten more severe, and whether that's because of a co-occurring OCD or depression or trauma, or whether it's because of substance use, the combination of factors has led to a more acute situation for the individual. It's very interesting. I think, again, we'll go back, into the early stages of the field's awareness of eating disorders and involving in treatment. There's probably less co-occurrence of substance use disorders among individuals with anorexia nervosa compared to bulimia and binge eating. It's certainly at higher levels of care. It's very common for the co-occurrence to be happening. It also presents in a little bit different ways sometimes, because either manage their eating disorder or to engage in behaviors related to their eating disorder. So someone with an eating disorder might become addicted to stimulants, for example, or cocaine, but it's not because they started out using it to get high or to get a rush. They started out to try to manage their appetite. And then so you've got a couple of factors, so you have all the addiction potential and dependence potential in that substance for anyone who takes it, but then you throw in the kind of the secondary gain that someone with an eating disorder might have for, like, oh, this curbs my appetite too, and I don't have to eat for the next 3 days. It's a stronger pull than to keep using the substance. So we see the substance use presenting in a little bit different way, where it wasn't just because peer pressure or friends were doing it or to get high, it was to affect their eating disorder in some way. So then you have to approach that a little bit differently when you're trying to work on the importance of, what could be the motivating factors for recovery for that person. A lot of it might be the same, but you may have to make sure you're addressing the eating disorder pull for the substance use as well.
Yeah. And I guess the other piece I'm thinking about, if I'm seeing this through the anxiety lens, is that just like the eating disorder can be a way of managing emotions or getting control or feeling safe or those kinds of things, or to avoid certain thoughts or feelings, etc. The substance use can be the same thing. It's another way of avoidance, or another way of sort of managing, and kind of in the same way that the eating disorder can play that role.
And that's such an important feature there, Chris. If you take away the diagnostic names or the labels, whatever you want to call it, and I try to think globally for an individual person. How do any of us deal with distress or upset, deal with stressful situations? And broadly, there are healthier ways of dealing with distress and problems, and less healthy ways or bad ways. And for some individuals, this doesn't define their eating disorder, but their eating disorder behaviors end up serving a purpose of helping them manage distress or problems. And so as we start to see somebody get better from their eating disorder symptoms and behaviors, and sometimes they might have replaced those eating disorder behaviors with something that's really good for an individual or really good for them moving forward. But sometimes, they've replaced it with some other thing, or maybe they didn't. This is where, like, maybe the substance use, maybe it wasn't a big factor in the past, but it's an easy factor to reach towards in our society. Alcohol is readily available. A lot of other substances are readily available. So I've got this eating disorder managed, and now this really awful thing happened to me. I'm so distressed. I haven't really worked on how to manage the distress in a healthy way. This alcohol is pretty readily available. And we see that shifting of kind of distress tolerance behaviors. And sometimes, it could be cutting, it could be self-injury, it could be other, even acting out behaviors. But globally, it's about how does stress get managed, or how do really impactful situations get managed. So that's where we see this popping up in people that might not have ever had a major problem before. They might have used substances or alcohol, but they might not have had a problem with it. So that's another somewhat novel way that it shows up in individuals who are working on recovery from eating disorders.
Yeah. And look, it doesn't even have to be substances, as you kind of talked about. It It can be like workaholism. It can be sex. It can be like, there's just so many different ways. And this is why, like, when I'm thinking about eating disorder recovery and the way that I work on it, like, yes, a lot of in the beginning, it's the stuff that we think of as the very classic stuff to work on connected to the eating disorder, whether that's the relationship with exercise, whether that's stuff around food, whether that's bringing in more calories, like all the things that are important as part of recovery. But it's then looking at, okay, how has the eating disorder tentacles got its way into all of these other facets of your life? And so this is, again, why I like this anxiety framing of eating disorders, because if you're framing it in that way, recovery really is teaching you how to then deal with when anxiety comes up or when unpleasant thoughts come up or difficult situations come up. And so, yeah, I definitely think of recovery very much through the resilience building lens. And if you're doing that correctly, then you're not just building resilience connected to food, you're doing it in sort of all aspects of life.
Right. And I think of that so often in terms of whether you're working with somebody in individual outpatient practice or in a treatment center, that it is more or less like trying on a lot of different things that might resonate for someone as a new coping skill, as a new thing in their life, as a new leisure activity. So if we look at things like, say, art therapy or art groups, it's not just for the art group or art therapy that day. It's that this might be something that someone can then, this can be something they flourish with as a new coping technique, or it could be a new passion or profession for the person. You just never know. So it's about continuing to offer or introduce as many new things as possible, because unfortunately, I think a lot of the bad things are readily available and highly promoted in the world around us. So it takes a little bit more thought to try to keep introducing or coming up with new things for any of us to try as ways of trying to manage our stress. I mean the stress in most broadest terms. I mean, some of the things we're talking about happening to people are extremely impactful events in a person's life. It's not just a matter of like managing your day-to-day stress. It's about, we're all going to have losses. We're all going to have major events in our lives. And those are the times when, whether it's an eating disorder, whether it's a substance use problem, whether it's depression, those are the times that those things are going to get more severe if we haven't done a good job about finding other ways of managing the distress that happens in those circumstances.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on that. And so I want to come back to the ERP piece that you mentioned before, the exposure response prevention. And so just like, so and for listeners know, like, there are lots of different modalities that I use when I'm working with people. I already mentioned polyvagal theory. I liked ACT, or acceptance and commitment therapy. I know you mentioned CBT and E. I think there's probably some overlap between those two things. That I know that ACT is an offshoot of CBT. I've also heard you talk on podcasts as well, and about the importance of the B part, like the behavior side, as opposed to so much of the cognitive side of CBT. And we are definitely on the same page with that I'm very much a believer that we act our way into thinking differently. We don't think our way into acting differently. And so much of the focus is on helping people to taking different actions and having that lead to different changes. And so, primarily I'm using ACT and polyvagal theory. I do use some NLP. I like self-compassion work. I like motivational interviewing, but I think really ACT and polyvagal theory are the predominant ones I use. And so for you, outside of ERP, what are the ones that you're predominantly using, or that Rogers are predominantly using?
Predominantly other versions of cognitive behavior therapy, or kind of the original cognitive behavior therapy, which, I often think of as large C, little b, but exposure-based work is more big B, little c. And then dialectical behavioral therapy skills, kind of the two, and then other stages of recovery, motivational interviewing. Those are the main kind of programmatically induced or infused techniques, and then individual therapists may pull from various modalities depending on what's going to work for that individual person.
Okay. And so I would love to go through ERP and what that looks like and how it can be used. Sure. And so let's imagine, I'm trying to think of a scenario that we could use, like maybe you think of the scenario because you know how it's better used. So give us a scenario of how this would be used.
Well, I usually try to explain it to someone based on more classic OCD principles so that it just is, I can think it hits home easier, and then people can start thinking about how to apply it to eating disorder symptoms and behaviors. But I usually start with a door handle. So for the viewers, I'll say the door handle behind your shoulder. If someone could imagine that that's a restroom, a public restroom door handle, that someone with OCD, of a contamination form of OCD, would have extreme anxiety, would probably have a panic attack. And this is the individual telling us this, that they would have a panic attack if they were to touch that doorknob today. So if we're going to describe an exposure-based approach to how to get to a point where they can manage that, we ask them to write out, and this is not, as you're indicating, it's not specific to Rogers, it's just the exposure-based principles are utilized a lot in this setting at Rogers. We would ask them to write out kind of each step up through the point of touching a door handle, like that they could imagine working on as an exercise to get to that point. Because the idea is facing the fear, not letting the continued avoidance of the fear continue to snowball. So if we ask them, like, do you think you could stand 10 feet away from it and look at the door handle? They say, then they might rate their anxiety, and say if they're using a 1 to 10 scale, they might say that would be maybe a level 4 of anxiety, but it would definitely be something different than my baseline. I would say, well, and touching the door handle is a 10. So we have our kind of scale here. And what about if we just didn't even look at the door handle? If you just thought about touching it, they might say, well, that would be a 2. And we go through each kind of step. Like, what if you were a foot away from the door handle? And then that's a 6. And so we just map out a progressive sequence of activities that they can work on to try to make sure that each step is managed. And we call it challenging, but manageable, that they're not going to. So, for example, the first exercise that we do won't be something that causes a panic attack. It will be something that causes noticeable anxiety, but not a full panic attack. And the idea here is that the person would then do the exercise, and this is usually with a therapist or a behavioral specialist working with them kind of at their elbow, so they have that support. And so we acknowledge that's kind of an accommodation or something that might neutralize some of the anxiety. But they will go through that exercise, and the therapist or behavior specialist will ask them to keep rating their anxiety. So we hope to see this kind of almost a bell-shaped curve. Their anxiety goes up, and then it comes back down with time. We ask them to just keep persisting till it comes back down to 50% or less of the peak of the anxiety. And then we repeat that, and we might repeat it, several times. And when we get to a place where the original peak of the anxiety is about 50% or less, so the new anxiety peak is 50% or less of the original, then we might consider that to be habituated to. We've had an exercise where somebody is habituated to it. We can cross that one off and start working on the next one. The next one might be to get a foot away from the door handle, and same thing, just kind of sit with it, with the anxiety, rating it with the behavior specialist or therapist. And you can see how it's very labor intensive. Theoretically, it's not overpowering. It's not that hard to wrap our head around, like why it's working or how it can work, but it takes a lot of effort on the part of the individual. And it takes a lot of good coaching and mentorship of the therapy around doing these exercises. And if you keep doing them and keep doing the repetition, eventually the person can touch the door handle without it causing a panic attack. And we see this play out over and over again with things that people come in saying they could never imagine they could touch that door handle. And with these progressive techniques, which are painstaking, they're challenging. So it's not about kind of sitting back and talking about the issue. It's about doing something very active and very challenging to get to a point where something that seemed impossible is now possible. So there's a very good place for sitting back and talking about something. There are lots of forms of therapy to do that. They're just driving home the point that this is not that. This is getting in there, doing it, and it's kind of all hands on deck. It helps if everybody is kind of on the same page about what we're doing with this. So in a treatment center, that means everybody on the staff is trained up on these basic principles. It means that we invite the families in to learn about these same principles as well, so that when a person goes home, their parent or loved one or spouse could help coach them through if they're hitting something that that is challenging for them at the time. So that's the basic principle of this progressive movement on exercises that are designed to bring out the anxiety, to have that rise and fall of the anxiety in a repetitive way so that person habituates to it, so that it's not having the same rise anymore. And it's also building resilience, because what a person learns is that over time, with all this repetition, that even we might have some cases where the peak never goes down. It keeps staying up high for some reason. For some individuals on certain exposures, it just doesn't go down. But they also learn that they've tolerated it. And the repetition of tolerating the anxiety is a wonderful resilience tool and experience, so that it's not foreign to someone if they start to feel that they're at a moderate to high moderate level of anxiety. It doesn't necessarily mean they're going to have a panic attack. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be in an unworkable situation. So those are kind of that's usually the way I try to explain to people who are starting this for the first time of how we're going to move forward. And then a person might come up with 150 different things that they want to work on. Some of them might be related specifically to like a type of food, or it could be related to a type of setting that they're going to eat at, whether it's like a restaurant or food being brought in. It could be about eating with certain people. It could be about preparation of food, and it could be something completely unrelated to their eating disorder. It could be about a contamination-related fear or a social anxiety fear that they'll work on. And this is the beauty of the individual form of it, that the individual is working on creating that list with their team so that they've had the main part of figuring out what it is that they want to work on while they're here, and what's going to be manageable at first, what's going to be in that 3 to 4 level of anxiety that will be manageable, because we don't want to start them at a 9 or 10. They'll likely get flooded, kind of sabotage the whole situation and the progress. But it's very much the individual taking ownership of what this will look like moving forward. We, of course, have suggestions on, if you have social anxiety, here like the 5 or 6 things that we've seen work really well. Any of these resonate with you? But other times people will be coming in like, I've got my list. Here's what from the first session to the next session, and I've got it all laid out. And it's a wonderful kind of collaboration on the treatment plan in real time.
Nice. Okay, so I've definitely got some follow-ups connected to everything you just said there. So I guess one of the first things that comes to mind, like if I'm thinking about this from a recovery standpoint and an eating disorder recovery standpoint, is I'm typically of the opinion that making bigger changes in recovery is actually easier. And look, the reason I say that is if we're using your example here, someone could say, okay, if we're creating our list of all of these different changes that I need to make, adding in an apple could feel like it's an anxiety provoking thing. And we could start with that. Like that's where you start, with adding in one solitary apple every day. The downside from my perspective with doing that, if we start too small, is that a lot of anxiety that occurs for making that change. And from a nutritional rehabilitation standpoint, there's not a huge amount of upside for that.
Right.
And if you do that over and over and over again, you could be sort of months down the line and yet still not getting a lot of upside for it. And where someone gets trapped with that is like, then there's this feeling of like, this isn't going to work. There's a lot more eating disorder thoughts that are unhelpful and coming up. And so the way that I'm wanting to do is kind of finding the sort of Goldilocks zone where, okay, cool, I don't want you to be having a panic attack. And I'm probably wanting you to do something that feels more challenging than you imagine that you're going to be able to be completely okay with. Because otherwise, what I see is like 6 months has gone by, there hasn't been much upside, and the person starts to feel like this is never going to work and try like, how do we stay out of that? So I'd love to hear your thoughts. I
agree that finding that middle ground is the very important piece of this. And in fact, like if we have somebody who's rating things to where they're like, I don't, that's not going to cause much anxiety, we're basically not even starting with those so that we don't create that just kind of feeling of, okay, I'm doing all this repetition on something that really wasn't that anxiety producing to begin with, or it's a small item.
Well, I mean, for example, an apple could feel like it's really anxiety provoking someone. And I'm still going to say, well, even if that may be true, the upside of you doing this is minimal, if anything. And so like, if that's at a 7, let's pick something that's in an 8 that's going to be giving you more bang for your buck, that you're going to genuinely benefit from this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And certainly what I presented is pretty overly simplistic, because what we have going on in real time is real in vivo or real life exposures happening all around the person, just being brought into a treatment environment, for example. Tons of 9s and 10s all over the place,
Yeah.
Maybe it's a roommate, maybe it's being away from home for the first time. All those things are a lot of different exposures. So it's not as controlled as like everything is a 3 or a 4. It's just when saying, okay, we're going to work on, say, preparing food, for example, like we're going to take a very systematic way of doing that.
Yeah.
But we know that we're automatically asking people to take a lot of those leaps with the meal plan, because we say we're going to be really progressive and systematic about how we do the rest of exposures, but we have to have stable nutrition moving forward at a faster pace than you might be comfortable with.
Okay.
And so we're going to give and take on that. Like, okay, we don't have to dive into touching the door handle for the contamination OCD tomorrow, because we know that we're basically asking you to do a lot of 8s and 9s, the meal plan, because we need that, the bigger bang for the buck. And hopefully we are getting some payoff there. Like if somebody is doing those bigger challenges and they're like, oh, this is actually more tolerable than I thought, then they're ready to dive into those other exposures more readily because they've had some success, because there's been the other kind of part that was so much cleaner in what I just had described about this process is it gives the assumption that somebody is perfectly accurate in predicting what each different exercise is going to cause them.
Yeah.
Which is the case. We're all going to be prone to mispredict what that's going to look like. And so somebody might have thought something would be very manageable, but it was through the roof kind of anxiety. So then we have to just reassess, where do we go from here with this? How much payoff are you going to get for this? And prioritize what's important, because we try to prioritize nutrition right away. We try to prioritize safety issues right away. And then again, a collaboration on what are the important things that are impairing your functioning at home. But I think with the food related items, especially, there's a lot of pushing to maybe levels of discomfort that we wouldn't necessarily push to right away with the other forms of exposure work that we feel like aren't as imperative or don't have as much impact on a person's nutritional status or their safety right now.
Okay, cool. That's actually really helpful to know. And look, just to touch on some of the things that you said that I'm very much in agreement in and want to highlight. Like one, I think so often people spend a lot of time in this kind of what if place with eating disorder recovery and coming up with all of the potential things that could happen, as opposed to like, let's run the experiment and see what happens. And so this is what I really love about the exposure piece of like, let's see what happens. It could be a complete disaster, and we'll know that. Or it could be, hey, there was really high anticipation anxiety, and then when I did it, it wasn't quite as bad as what I thought. And within half an hour, that had really kind of come down, and that was much quicker than I thought. And so that recognition, as you said, that there is this curve where go up and then it comes down of its own accord. Or even if that doesn't happen, I've learned that I'm able to tolerate it. Because I think that's really the piece that I'm wanting to just kind of hammer home again and again when working with people is like, you are able and capable of being able to tolerate these things. Like you are having thoughts that are telling you you are incapable of doing that, but actually you are. And the reason you may not feel like you can do this, you just haven't practiced it enough yet. You truly are going to be able to tolerate these things. And that's why, again, getting out of the what if thinking and more into the action taking is just so important. Yeah. So I guess the final piece I wanted to ask connected to this is, can you use it with something that someone is now avoiding? So for example, if someone is saying, if the goal is taking time off exercise, how would you use ERP connected to that? Considering, okay, this is then an ongoing, is it around when the urges come up that we then practice this and we notice the urges come down, and then 2 hours later the urges come up and we're using it there? Or is it done in some other way, or you just don't use it in that setting?
Well, we do use it and just so I clarified, you mean like with individuals who are compulsively exercising or over-exercising, how might we apply those principles?
Yes, exactly. And so, for example, often when I'm working with someone in that situation, the goal is, okay, we're going to have, for example, let's start with a week off exercise. We're going to have a week off exercise just so that we can start to rebuild your relationship with exercise. We can get you having the energy that was used for that exercise now into being used to repair and recover. And so how would you use then ERP to deal with that situation? It
is complicated. Depends on a number of things. But yes, we do use similar principles for the exercise pieces. One of the things that complicates it is, where is somebody medically and nutritionally? So if somebody's really in a danger zone medically and nutritionally, we really are working with them on, like, we kind of have to do this thing that will feel like flooding. Like we just have to get to know exercise.
You just force them to do it.
Yeah. And then other people, though, if we're not in a major danger zone with that acutely, we might engage them in that collaboration around an exercise reduction protocol so that they're not feeling flooded by that drastic change, which is, as you might imagine, counterintuitive and also not in complete alignment with what some other settings might do. But because we might be at an inpatient unit, somebody might be allowed to do some observable form of physical activity. If we've kind of cleared it medically, with the idea we're going to gradually reduce that physical activity to a point where then we will want cessation, and they'll collaborate with us on this. It's important to get to a point of the cessation so we can rebuild this activity in a way that will be in alignment with your goals and values. And so then as we start to rebuild it, it's very much of those exposure-based principles. It might be, if we have a fitness therapist who will use those exposure-based principles of, okay, we're designing something where we might start off with, for some individuals, it might look like, here's a prescribed number of minutes you might be able to go on the treadmill at this pace. Other individuals, it might be, you've gotten so ritualized with your exercise that it's most important to try to not have so much compulsion around the exact number of minutes. So we're going to have the therapist sort of randomly pick the end for the session. So today it might be 4 minutes, the next day it might be 8 minutes, the next day it might be 12 minutes, but it's not in the person's control. So that exposure of not knowing when it's going to end and being able to try to deal with the feelings and the anxiety of not having that certainty on it is part of the exercise moving forward, to try to have it be more in alignment with and we have them do a whole inventory of their goals, their values as it relates to physical activity, what that role that's playing in the person's life, and trying to get it away from the eating disorder centered goals and more towards the full goals and values someone is talking about, whether it's socializing with friends, whether it's having a generally good, healthy body in terms of longevity of living. Like, all those things would be factored into setting up a routine, or in some cases a lack of routine, and more just enjoyment and spontaneity with physical activity. So yes, very much use the exposure-based principles on that, both in the coming down, if somebody's having trouble just doing the cold turkey, and if it's medically safe to do so, and then ramping back up if that's important to that individual.
Okay, nice. Definitely makes sense. So yeah, this has been awesome. I'm really glad that we've been able to go through all this. As I said, I've never talked about ERP before. And so to hear how Rogers is using it, how it can be applicable in different settings and at different stages that someone's at, I think it's been really helpful to hear this. So where can people find more information either about you or about Rogers? Where do you want to point people to? And I'll put all of these in the show notes.
I think the website for Rogers would be the site, and we'll put the contact information in the site at the end of this podcast. But the website is the best place for information. It'll have all of the connection in terms of either getting in contact with different service lines. Rogers is a full behavioral health treatment center, not just for eating disorders. So there may be other co-occurring issues or ones that are dealing with something else that is not related to eating disorders. Rogers has treatment center service lines for various mental health issues.
Perfect. Well, right, I will put all of that in the show notes. So yeah, thanks so much for your time today, Brad. It was a really great getting to chat with you.
Great. Same here, Chris. We appreciate the opportunity.
So that was my conversation with Dr. Brad Smith. Once I stopped recording, Brad mentioned that one of the things he didn't say in the interview was just how good Rogers are for the multidisciplinary team that they have, and that this is really a strength of theirs, in that there are all these different areas that they can be supporting someone with, and all in this sort of one-stop shop. And I don't have any personal experience with Rogers. I don't have any clients that I can think of who have been to Rogers. But from what Brad was saying in the interview and how he was talking about Rogers and just hearing him speak, yeah, I'm a fan of what they are doing and the approach that they are taking. So as I said at the top, I'm taking on new clients. If this is something that you want help with and you want to stop living with an eating disorder and start having a much fuller life, then I would love to help you can send an email to info@7-health.com and just put coaching in the subject line. So that is it for this week's episode. I will catch you again next week. Until then, take care and I'll see you soon.